Have you ever wondered why Russia is often portrayed as America's biggest enemy? Why do the headlines make Vladimir Putin out to be a boogeyman? Have you ever stopped to question the real reason for the conflict in Ukraine? It's time to delve deeper and uncover the truth behind the making of a boogeyman. Join us on a journey through history as we explore the forces that have shaped the perception of Russia and its leader and the real reason behind the conflict in Ukraine. Are you ready to question everything you thought you knew? Then let's begin.
Whatever man wishes to see in our mother Russia is there to find.
Newspaper headlines tell the story of the usual Russian secrecy. This launching is from previous film. It's in a little more than 25 hours.
We will take this step by step, beginning from the roots, so make sure you stay glued to the screen. Also, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, now is the right time. The events in Ukraine are a reminder of how the legacy of the Cold War continues to shape our world today. Anders Fogh Rasmussen, former NATO Secretary General. We all know that the Cold War was a time of intense tension and mistrust between the United States and the Soviet Union. It was a time when the world was divided into two opposing camps, and the threat of nuclear war loomed large. However, despite the end of the Cold War, the tension between the United States and Russia continues to this day. It was, in fact, a defining period in history, shaping the global landscape in ways that are still felt today. At the heart of this struggle was the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union, and it was during this time that America began to shape its perception of Russia as a global adversary. It all started with the rise of communism and the spread of Soviet influence across Eastern Europe. The United States saw the Soviet Union as a threat to its way of life and to the world as a whole. The stage was set for a global power struggle that would come to define the rest of the 20th century. The United States began a massive military buildup, developing weapons of mass destruction and increasing its military presence around the world. The Soviet Union responded in kind, and the two superpowers found themselves locked in a dangerous game of brinksmanship. The world was on edge, and one misstep could have led to a global catastrophe. But the true impact of the Cold War was felt not just on the battlefield, but in the hearts and minds of people around the world. America's demonization of the Soviet Union and its leaders shaped the perception of Russia for generations to come. American foreign policy decisions have long shaped the geopolitical landscape, and this is particularly true in the case of the conflict in Ukraine. The conflict has its roots in the expanding influence of NATO and the West's efforts to draw Ukraine away from Russia and closer to the European Union. Despite knowing that these actions would likely trigger a defensive response from Putin and the Kremlin, the United States continued to encourage Ukraine's integration with Europe and refused to rule out its admission into NATO's military alliance. Furthermore, the U.S. saw the integration of Ukraine with the EU as a way to strengthen its sphere of influence and maintain its dominance in the region. However, these decisions also carried with them a high risk, as Putin and Russia saw NATO expansion and a westernized Ukraine as an existential threat to their core security interests. The U.S. ultimately found itself in a precarious position, as it was not willing to expend American lives or risk a nuclear war in defense of Ukrainian sovereignty. Nevertheless, this support for Ukraine's independence has been criticized as reckless and short-sighted, as it has resulted in a devastating conflict in Ukraine and the emergence of Putin and Russia as major geopolitical adversaries. The views of America's national security elite have evolved over time in regard to the conflict in Ukraine and the making of a boogeyman in Putin and Russia. Initially, leading figures in America's foreign policy establishment, such as George Kennan, called NATO expansion a strategic blunder of potentially epic proportions. Thomas Friedman also declared it the most ill-conceived project of the post-Cold War era. Henry Kissinger, a living legend in American foreign policy, argued that the West must understand that to Russia, Ukraine can never be just a foreign country. He believed that Ukraine should function as a bridge between Russia and the West and pursue a posture similar to that of Finland, where it cooperates with the West but avoids institutional hostility towards Russia. Zbigniew Brzezinski, a former national security advisor, also embraced the Finland model for Ukraine. Despite these views, American support for Ukraine's integration with Europe continued, leading to the current conflict in Ukraine. Some argue that Putin's invasion of Ukraine was a predictable response to American policy choices, but not necessarily a justified one.
President Vladimir Putin is a keen student of history. He has interwoven his personal history with the history of Russia. And right outside the Kremlin is this giant statue of another Vladimir, Vladimir the Great, Grand Prince of Kiev. 1,000 years ago, ruling this region from Kiev, this Vladimir introduced Christianity to this place. President Vladimir Putin uses history and religion to explain his opinions and to justify his actions. This Vladimir was only unveiled in 2016. Anyone who says President Putin's actions could never have been predicted, that he is unpredictable, that we couldn't have seen it coming, wasn't paying attention.
While many others see American support for Ukraine as an imperial act of aggression against Russia, realists like John Mersheimer equate explanation and justification, seeing a fully independent Ukraine as a threat to Russian security. Another very important event in this story is the Orange Revolution, but to understand it better, we may have to go back in time. We are in the 20th century. The Soviet Union is a major political force, exerting its influence and control over countries within its borders, including Ukraine. But then comes its fall in 1991, and this marks the start of a new era for Ukraine, as it declares independence and sets out to forge its own path in the world. The United States sees Ukraine as a potential ally in its sphere of influence and provides support for Ukrainian politicians and movements that align with its interests, seeking to bring the country closer to the West. Tensions between the United States and Russia continue to simmer, despite the end of the Cold War. The expansion of NATO only adds to the tension, as Russia views it as a direct threat to its security. This, along with America's support for pro-Western movements in Ukraine, makes the country a key flashpoint in U.S.-Russia relations. Ukraine finds itself caught in the middle, torn between its historical ties to Russia and its desire to align with the West. It is a delicate balancing act with far-reaching consequences for the country and its place in the world. Fast forward to 2004.
Demonstrators clash with police, with hundreds of thousands protesting the results
Yes,
of the
the
election
Orange Revolution,
and calling
a
for a
political
new vote.
movement sparked by widespread allegations of fraud during the presidential elections. The pro-Western Ukrainian politicians organized the protests, which brought hundreds of thousands of people take to the streets, demanding a rerun of the elections. This marked a clear shift towards a more pro-Western orientation in Ukraine and brought the country to the forefront of global attention. But the events of the Orange Revolution also had significant consequences for U.S.-Russia relations, as Russia saw it as a direct challenge to its sphere of influence in the region. The pro-Western politicians who emerged from the Orange Revolution were seen as a direct threat to Russia's interests, exacerbating tensions between the two countries. The events of the Orange Revolution mark a turning point in Ukraine's history and continue to shape its future as a key flashpoint in U.S.-Russia relations. And then, once again, the winter of 2014 brought another catastrophic news, as the country was plunged into chaos and conflict. The streets of Kyiv were filled with the sounds of protesters demanding change as they took to the streets to express their frustrations with the government's decision to abandon talks with the European Union and move closer to Russia. At first, it seemed like just another political protest, but as the days passed, The movement grew in size and strength, attracting thousands of people from all walks of life who were determined to make their voices heard. The government tried to silence the protesters, but the flames of revolution were already burning brightly, fueled by the people's desire for greater political freedom and accountability. And then, in a moment that would change the course of Ukrainian history, the government fell and a new pro-Western president was elected. But this new government was met with fierce opposition from Russia, which saw it as a direct threat to its interests in the region. In a bold and audacious move, Russia annexed Crimea, and as the conflict in Ukraine escalated, Russian-backed separatists declared independence in the Donbas region, leading to ongoing fighting in eastern Ukraine. The world watched in shock as events unfolded, and it soon became clear that Ukraine was at the center of a larger global struggle, caught between the West and Russia. Now it wasn't only Ukraine, but the US too, who was desperate to gain access to the Russian borders, and thus it invited and politically guided Ukraine to join NATO. In a world where perception often trumps reality, the way a country is perceived by the world can have far-reaching consequences. The narrative surrounding a nation can shape the way its people are seen, the way its policies are perceived, and ultimately, the way it is treated by other nations. However, the narrative surrounding Ukraine has been influenced by forces beyond its borders, with various media outlets and politicians painting a picture of a Boogeyman, a dangerous and unpredictable entity that threatens the stability of the region. The truth, of course, is more complicated and requires a deeper understanding of the history and context of the situation. It is the story of how a country's reputation can be shaped by forces beyond its control, and how the making of a Boogeyman can have far-reaching consequences for a nation and its people. The story of Ukraine is not just one of a country in conflict, but a tale of how perception and narrative can shape the reality of a nation. As the world continues to watch the events unfold in Ukraine, it is important to understand the complexity and context of the situation, and to challenge the narratives that seek to simplify a complex and multifaceted story. Thank you for joining us on this journey to understand the making of a Boogeyman. We hope this information has been intriguing and educational. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more content like this. Until next time, farewell.